Listen to me carefully before you scroll, before you blink, before you decide this is just another story on your screen, because what you're about to hear is not fiction dressed as drama, it is pain dressed as silence, and if you have ever loved your mother, if you have ever swallowed humiliation to keep peace, if you have ever been laughed at when your heart was breaking, then stay with me until the very last word, subscribe, like, and comment your support because stories like mine survive only when people choose to listen, and it all began on the night my husband laughed when he heard my mother had died, not a nervous laugh, not disbelief, but a sharp careless sound that cut through me like glass, the kind of laugh that tells you exactly where you stand in someone's heart, or rather how little space you occupy there, and I remember standing in our kitchen holding my phone, the screen still glowing with my sister's name, her voice still echoing in my ears telling me through broken sobs that Mama was gone, that she collapsed before dawn, that she kept calling my name even as her breath slipped away, and my knees buckled but I didn't fall because I had learned long ago how to stay standing while everything inside me collapsed, and when I told my husband, when I whispered it like a fragile secret, my mother is dead, he looked up from his phone, smirked, and said, so, before laughing and adding, we have guests tonight, don't start your drama now, and in that moment something ancient and heavy settled into my chest, because grief is one thing but being denied the right to grieve is another cruelty entirely, and this wasn't the first time he had dismissed my pain, just the first time it came wrapped around death itself, and I want you to understand the weight of that moment, because this wasn't a man who had always been cruel, at least not openly, he had been charming once, attentive in public, generous with smiles when people were watching, but behind closed doors his kindness had conditions, and my obedience was the currency that bought temporary peace, and my mother had always warned me in her gentle way, never directly attacking him, never poisoning me with hatred, just saying softly, a man who laughs at tears will one day laugh at graves, and I used to think she was exaggerating, mothers always fear the worst, until that night proved her right, and the guests he mentioned were important, colleagues from his company, including his boss, a man he admired with almost embarrassing devotion, and canceling the dinner was unthinkable to him, my grief was an inconvenience, my loss a scheduling issue, and I stood there numb while he instructed me to finish cooking, to change my face, to act normal, because appearances mattered more than my broken heart, and I want you to pause here, take a breath, and ask yourself, what kind of marriage demands silence at the moment of loss, and yet I complied, not because I agreed, but because years of emotional erosion teach you that resistance costs more than surrender. So I washed my face, reapplied makeup with shaking hands, and put on the black dress that hugged my body while my soul felt hollow, and as I moved through the house setting the table, my mind replayed memories of my mother, her hands braiding my hair, her voice defending me when no one else did, her eyes lighting up every time I walked into a room, and now she was gone, and I hadn't even cried properly. Because grief had been postponed like an unwanted task, and the doorbell rang, laughter filled the house, coats were taken, compliments exchanged, and I slipped into the role expected of me, the quiet wife, the efficient hostess, the woman who smiles while serving plates, and as the evening progressed my husband told jokes, exaggerated his achievements, laughed loudly, especially whenever his boss laughed, and I noticed how he straightened his posture around that man, how eager he was for approval, and at some point during dinner, someone mentioned family, casual harmless talk, and his boss asked me politely about my parents, and before I could answer, my husband waved his hand dismissively and said, her mother died today, followed by another laugh, louder this time, as if my mother's death were an absurd inconvenience, a punchline meant to entertain, and the room fell into an awkward silence, forks paused mid-air, eyes shifted toward me, and I felt the tears rise despite my effort to control them, and they spilled, hot and unstoppable, onto my cheeks as I stood there holding a serving dish, my vision blurring, my chest tightening, and I heard my husband scoff and whisper sharply, get a grip, and I want you to understand that this was the moment something changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but profoundly, because grief has a way of revealing truths that comfort never does. And as I stood there crying quietly, trying to remain invisible, my husband's boss stood up, walked toward me slowly, and gently took the dish from my hands, his touch respectful, human, something I hadn't felt in a long time, and he asked softly, why are you crying? And for a split second I hesitated, years of conditioning telling me to lie, to protect my husband's image, to swallow the truth, but grief stripped me bare, and I told him everything in a few simple words. That my mother had died that morning, that she was my only parent, that I hadn't even had time to process it, and as I spoke, my husband laughed again and said, "She's exaggerating, you know how emotional women are," and that was when his boss turned slowly, looked at him with an expression I will never forget, not anger, not shock, but something colder, something like disappointment mixed with recognition, as if a puzzle had finally completed itself, and he said calmly, "Everyone knew your wife's mother." And my husband frowned, confused, still smiling, and then the man continued. "Everyone except you," and the room was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, and then he added words that would fracture the foundation my husband stood on, words that would change the power in that room forever, words that connected my private grief to a truth my husband had never imagined, and before I tell you exactly what he said, before I let this moment unfold completely, I need you to stay with me, because this story is not just about betrayal, it is about dignity. It is about the quiet strength of a woman pushed to the edge, and it is about how truth has a way of standing up when you are too tired to do it yourself. So if this story has touched you even a little, like the video, subscribe for more real stories like this, and comment below if you believe respect should never die before love, because in the next part, I will tell you what his boss revealed, and how one sentence shattered my husband's laughter forever. The room felt heavier than it had moments before, like the air itself had thickened after his boss's words, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as I stood there, exposed and trembling, while my husband's confident smile faltered for the first time that night, and his boss didn't raise his voice or dramatize the moment. He didn't need to, because authority doesn't shout, it simply speaks and expects to be heard. And he looked at my husband and said, with a calm that was almost surgical, "Your wife's mother was one of the strongest women I ever knew," and my husband laughed again instinctively, out of habit, but it came out weak and uncertain this time, and he said, "You must be mistaken," as if denying the truth could erase it, and that was when his boss turned his attention back to me, his eyes softening, and he said something that felt like a hand on my back keeping me from collapsing. "She worked 2 jobs to put her daughter through school, she volunteered at the community center, she took care of people who weren't even related to her," and with every word, my chest tightened and loosened at the same time, because someone was finally speaking my mother's name with respect, with recognition, and then he looked back at my husband and said the words that sliced through the room like a blade wrapped in velvet, "She is my sister," and the silence that followed was absolute. Not even the clink of cutlery dared interrupt it, and I saw my husband's face drain of color, saw his mouth open slightly, his eyes darting between me and his boss as if searching for a punchline that never came, and in that moment, I understood something profound. Grief had stripped me of everything except truth, and truth had finally found its voice through someone else, and my husband stammered, trying to recover, trying to reassert control, muttering something about not knowing, about how I never mentioned it, and his boss cut him off gently but firmly, "You never asked," he said, and those 3 words landed heavier than any insult, because they exposed years of neglect in a single sentence, and he continued, addressing the entire table now, "When someone laughs at death, it tells you how lightly they hold life," and I felt tears streaming down my face again, but this time they were different, they weren't just pain, they were release, because for the first time that night, I wasn't alone in my grief. And my husband shifted in his chair, uncomfortable, smaller. Somehow, the man who had demanded obedience now reduced to a boy caught misbehaving, and his boss turned back to me and said, "You should be with your family right now, not serving dinner," and those words felt like permission I had been denied my entire marriage, permission to choose myself, permission to feel, and I looked at my husband, searching his face for remorse, for apology, for anything human, but he avoided my eyes, staring at the table as if the wood grain could save him, and I realized then that his laughter earlier hadn't come from ignorance, it had come from entitlement, from the belief that my pain was insignificant compared to his comfort, and that belief had just been dismantled in front of everyone who mattered to him, and the guests murmured softly, sympathy replacing awkwardness, judgment creeping into their expressions, and my husband's boss placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder and said, "We will take care of this," and by this, he didn't just mean the dinner, he meant the imbalance of power that had ruled my life for years, and I excused myself, walking away from the table with my head high for the first time in a long while, and as I moved down the hallway, I heard voices behind me, hushed but intense, my husband explaining, defending, minimizing, and his boss listening, not sympathetically, but attentively, because attention itself can be a form of judgment. And in the guest room, I finally allowed myself to sit on the bed and sob, deep Body-shaking sobs that felt like they might split me open, and I cried for my mother, for the goodbye I never got to say properly, for the years I had spent shrinking myself to fit into someone else's comfort, and as I cried, memories flooded back, small moments I had dismissed as normal but now saw clearly, my husband interrupting me when I spoke, mocking my concerns, telling me I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too much, and I realized how grief sharpens clarity, how loss burns away illusion. And when I eventually emerged from the room, my eyes swollen but my spine straight, the house felt different, quieter, as if the walls themselves had shifted, and the guests were leaving early, murmuring condolences, avoiding my husband's gaze, and his boss stayed behind, speaking to him privately, their voices low but firm, and I caught fragments of the conversation, words like respect, boundaries, consequences. And for the first time, my husband was the one being instructed, not me, and when they finally finished, his boss came to me and said, "I'll make sure you're not alone tonight," and those words meant more than he probably knew, because loneliness in marriage is a particular kind of cruelty, and as he left, promising to help with arrangements, to support me however I needed, I stood in the doorway and watched his car disappear down the street, feeling both shattered and strangely lighter, and my husband approached me cautiously, his earlier arrogance replaced with uncertainty. And he said my name like it was a question, like he wasn't sure he had the right to say it anymore, and I looked at him and realized that the laughter I had heard earlier had broken something irreversibly, not because his boss spoke, but because I finally listened to what his laughter revealed about him, and as I stood there in the quiet aftermath of that night, surrounded by half-cleared plates and extinguished candles, I understood that this story wasn't just about a cruel moment, it was about a choice I now faced, whether to return to silence or step into a life where my pain was acknowledged, and before I tell you what decision I made, before I reveal how this night reshaped everything that followed, I need you to stay with me, because the next part isn't about revenge or drama, it's about reclaiming dignity after it's been stripped away, so if you're still listening, if this story resonates with you, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment if you believe no one has the right to laugh at your grief, because in the next part, I'll tell you what happened when the house finally emptied, and I was left alone with the man who thought my mother's death was a joke. When the last car pulled away and the house settled into an unnatural quiet, the kind that rings in your ears louder than noise ever could, I stood in the middle of the living room surrounded by the remains of a night that had changed everything, half-empty glasses, plates stacked carelessly, chairs slightly out of place, all of it evidence of how quickly a carefully controlled world can unravel. And my husband lingered near the doorway as if unsure whether he belonged inside the space with me anymore, and for the first time in years, I didn't rush to fill the silence for him, I didn't apologize, I didn't explain myself, I let the quiet stretch until it became uncomfortable, because discomfort had lived in me for far too long without complaint, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and defensive, not remorseful, and that difference mattered more than he realized, because remorse acknowledges harm, while defensiveness only protects pride, and he said he hadn't known, that he didn't mean it that way, that everyone was overreacting, and as he spoke, I watched him closely, really watched him, noticing how his words circled around consequences rather than my pain, how he mentioned his boss's reaction more than my tears, and I realized that this was the man I had been married to all along, not the charming version he presented to the world, but the one who measured worth in status and control, and I felt something inside me finally settle, a decision forming quietly. Without drama or rage, just clarity, and I told him I was leaving to go to my mother's house, the house that now felt unbearably empty but still held pieces of her in every corner, and he scoffed at first, saying it wasn't the right time, that people would talk, that I was being emotional, and that word, emotional, landed differently now, because I finally understood how often it had been used to silence me, and I looked at him and said calmly that my mother had just died, and if there was ever a right time to be emotional, this was it, and something in my tone made him step back, not physically, but internally, because certainty is intimidating to those who rely on confusion to maintain control, and I packed a small bag without rushing, each movement deliberate, grounding, and as I moved through the house, memories surfaced, arguments whispered late at night, apologies I had accepted too quickly, dreams I had postponed indefinitely, and I wondered how many times my mother had sensed my unhappiness but chose not to interfere, trusting that I would find my way when I was ready, and when I reached the door, my husband said my name again, this time sharper, warning me not to make things worse, and I turned to him and said something I had never said before, not loudly, not angrily, but clearly, you already did, and I walked out, the cool night air hitting my face like a baptism, and as I drove to my mother's house, the streets blurred through my tears, but my mind felt strangely focused, replaying the moment his boss spoke, the way truth had entered the room without asking permission, and I realized that my mother hadn't just raised me to endure, she had raised me to recognize dignity, even if it took me longer than she would have liked, and when I arrived, the house smelled like her, faintly of soap and tea, and I collapsed onto her bed, clutching one of her scarves, finally allowing myself to grieve fully without being watched or judged, and in that space, alone but not empty, I spoke to her out loud, telling her everything I hadn't said before, apologizing for staying quiet for so long, thanking her for loving me without conditions, and promising her that I would not let her daughter remain small anymore, and in the days that followed, the consequences of that dinner began to unfold in ways my husband hadn't anticipated. Because reputations are fragile when built on performance rather than character, and word traveled quickly at his workplace. Not as gossip, but as concern about judgment, about values, about leadership potential, and his boss, now no longer just a figure of authority but family in a way my husband could never compete with, made it clear that disrespect had professional implications, and while no dramatic firing took place, opportunities slowed, conversations changed, and the laughter my husband once relied on to charm others no longer landed the same way, and through it all, he tried to reach me, calling, texting, apologizing in fragments, promising change, but I noticed how his apologies focused on loss of standing rather than loss of trust, and that told me everything I needed to know, and as I navigated my grief, arranging my mother's funeral with the help of people who truly loved her, I felt supported in a way I hadn't felt in years, and standing by her grave, listening to stories about her kindness, her strength, her quiet impact, I felt a deep, steady resolve take root, because if she had lived a life of dignity under far harsher conditions, then I could at least honor her by demanding respect in my own, and when I finally met my husband again, days later, it wasn't for reconciliation, it was for closure, and I told him calmly that I needed space, real space, not as punishment, but as preservation, and for once, he didn't argue, because some truths arrive too fully formed to be debated, and as I walked away from that conversation, I felt grief still heavy but no longer suffocating, because grief shared with self-respect transforms into strength. And before I tell you how this choice reshaped my future, how choosing myself altered everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and worth, I want you to stay with me, because the final part of this story isn't about endings, it's about beginnings born from loss, and if you've ever wondered whether silence is safer than truth, stay until the end. Like the video, subscribe, and comment if you believe that no one's grief should ever be a joke, because what happened next was something I never imagined, but something my mother would have been proud of. What happened next did not arrive like a sudden miracle or a dramatic victory, it arrived quietly, the way real change always does, through small moments that accumulate until one day you realize you are no longer the same person who once accepted crumbs as a meal, and in the weeks after my mother's funeral, as the flowers wilted and visitors slowly returned to their lives, I stayed in her house and allowed myself to live without performing for anyone, waking up when my body needed rest, crying when memories surfaced, laughing unexpectedly at things she used to say, and in that space I began to hear my own thoughts clearly for the first time in years, and what they told me was uncomfortable but freeing, that love without respect is not love, that loyalty demanded through fear is not loyalty, and that marriage should never require you to bury your grief to protect someone else's comfort, and my husband continued to reach out, his messages growing longer, more polished, filled with words like regret and realization, but still missing the one thing I needed most, accountability, because accountability does not explain, it accepts, and I noticed how every message ended with how hard this was for him, how embarrassed he felt, how unfair the consequences seemed, and I understood then that his transformation was not about empathy, it was about survival. And that clarity gave me peace instead of anger, because anger ties you to the very thing you are trying to escape, and peace loosens that grip, and during this time, my uncle, the man I now knew not just as my husband's boss but as my mother's brother, checked on me regularly, not as a superior, not as an authority figure, but as family, sharing stories about my mother I had never heard, about her stubborn kindness, her quiet sacrifices, the pride she carried for me even when I doubted myself, and through those conversations, I realized something profound, my mother's legacy was not her suffering, it was her strength. And honoring her did not mean enduring what hurt me, it meant choosing differently when I finally had the courage, and that courage arrived one ordinary morning as I sat at her kitchen table, sunlight spilling across the worn surface, and I decided to return to my own life not as a wife trying to keep peace, but as a woman reclaiming agency. And when I met my husband one final time to discuss practical matters, there were no raised voices, no accusations, just truth laid gently but firmly between us, and I told him that laughter in the face of loss reveals character, and his had shown me who he was when it mattered most, and I told him I was choosing separation, not out of spite, but out of self-respect, and for the first time, he didn't argue, he simply nodded, defeated, because sometimes the greatest consequence is being truly seen, and as I walked away from that chapter, I felt grief still present but no longer defining, because grief had become a teacher rather than a prison. Teaching me that silence is not strength, endurance is not love, and that dignity is non-negotiable, and as I began rebuilding my life, returning to work, reconnecting with parts of myself I had abandoned, I noticed something unexpected. My voice was stronger, my posture different, my boundaries clearer, and people responded to that change, not because I demanded respect loudly, but because I carried it quietly. And now, as I share this story with you, I want you to understand that this is not a tale of revenge or humiliation. It is a reminder that the moment someone laughs at your pain, they reveal a truth you cannot afford to ignore, and if you are listening to this and seeing pieces of yourself in my silence, my hesitation, my fear of rocking the boat, know this: it is never too late to choose yourself, even if it takes loss to wake you up. And before I end, I ask you to pause and reflect. How do the people in your life respond when you are hurting? Because that response tells you everything. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you feel seen or understood, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it, because stories like these are not just entertainment, they are mirrors, and sometimes, seeing yourself clearly is the first step toward freedom. As this story comes to its quiet close, I want you to understand something deeply. This was never just about a husband who laughed or a boss who spoke, it was about a moment that stripped away illusion and left only truth standing, because sometimes life does not shout to wake us up, it waits until we are most vulnerable and then places a mirror in front of us, and in that reflection we finally see what we have been avoiding for years. And when I look back now, I no longer remember that night only with pain. I remember it as the night my silence ended, the night my mother's death, though devastating, became the moment her strength passed fully into me, because she taught me something even in her absence, that love without dignity is not love at all, and that no relationship, no title, no marriage is worth the cost of your self-respect, and life after separation was not magically easy. Grief does not disappear just because you choose yourself. Some nights were still heavy, some mornings still lonely, but there was a difference. I was no longer alone inside myself. I no longer had to measure my words, soften my pain, or make myself smaller to keep peace, and that freedom, even when painful, was honest, and honesty heals in ways silence never can. And I began to notice how differently I breathed, how my shoulders no longer carried constant tension, how my laughter, when it came, was real and not a performance, and I realized that healing does not mean forgetting what happened, it means no longer allowing it to define your worth. And my husband's laughter, once so powerful in its cruelty, became small and irrelevant in the story of my life, because people who mock pain eventually lose the ability to understand love, and that is their punishment, not yours. And if you are listening to this story and feeling a knot in your chest, if you recognize the feeling of being dismissed, belittled, or told your emotions are too much, please hear this clearly: your pain is valid, your grief deserves respect, and anyone who laughs at your suffering is showing you who they are. Believe them the first time, because you do not owe anyone your silence, and you do not need a dramatic moment or someone powerful to speak for you to choose yourself. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away quietly and never explain again. And my mother's voice still lives in me now, not as warning, but as reassurance, reminding me that strength does not always look loud. Sometimes it looks like leaving, sometimes it looks like starting over, and sometimes it looks like telling your story so others know they are not alone. And if this story moved you, if it made you reflect on your own life, your own relationships, then I ask you to support this channel, like this video so it reaches someone who needs it, subscribe for more real, emotional stories that speak the truths many are afraid to say, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here. Because when we listen to each other's stories, we create a space where pain is not mocked, grief is not minimized, and dignity is never negotiable. Thank you for staying until the end, and remember, anyone can laugh, but it takes courage to stand with someone in their darkest moment. Choose courage, choose respect, and most of all, choose yourself.